So AMD stock is down just around 7% in the after hours due to the Q3 earnings release. In my opinion, this is a hugely negative overreaction to what the actual numbers are kind of pointing to for kind of future for AMD. If you look at Dr. Ian Contreras, he actually mentioned that it is their kind of best quarter earnings ever at 6.8 billion or so. We also know that they kind of came in around their guidance in the previous quarter at 6.7 plus minus 300, just above the middle point of that. But also interesting point here for me is that, as I mentioned, we knew that the gaming would be weak. Embedded would have kind of recovered a little bit, as we can see here, because Lisa Su has mentioned over the past 9 months that embedded would kind of recover a little bit by end of this year. And we kind of see a little bit of recovery. So this is at least going in the right direction. Gaming obviously was weaker than even I expected. Remember my own numbers. I kind of had gaming at I think 5 or so 100 millions. Actually, if you look at it quite quickly here, you can see that I expected, yeah, just below 600 million, and they came in below 500 million or so in the gaming. And we know that the reception for the Ryzen Zen 5 CPUs has not been great on the consumer side. EPIC lineup, which is also based on Zen 5 in the data center, the general purpose data center segment of AMD. Remember that the data center consists of the AI GPUs and the general purpose CPUs. But again, the EPIC part, which is also based on the Zen 5, is kind of doing really great. Actually, if you look at my own numbers, I expect that EPIC is selling just below 1.9 billion. So let's say just below 2 billion, and the Instinct, which is the AI GPUs, at 1.6 billion, which is again, almost 50% increase quarter over quarter, only on the AI GPU part, whereas the EPIC lineup is also growing, but a bit slower. But remember that they are competing against Intel there, and they are doing really great, AMD in this case, against Intel, and I believe they are doing fairly okay against Nvidia. Obviously, Nvidia is in their league of their own, but it's good to see that they are getting some kind of traction out there. Not to the levels of Nvidia, but again, if you go from, let's say, 600 million in Q1 to 1.6 billion in Q3, I don't think that's bad. Maybe the expectations are a bit unrealistic, I don't know. But again, in Q4 I expect AMD to be close to 2 billion, maybe a little bit over 2 billion, which is great. And remember that when we talk about data center, for example, if you look at Nvidia's numbers there, you'll see that the total data center revenue for Nvidia consists of compute, i.e. or AI GPUs, and networking. And the interesting part here is that AMD just recently launched also their equivalent of networking for AMD GPUs, which we expect to enter the market at some point early next year. And as you can see for Nvidia, those numbers are around 10, 15, may sometimes 20% or even above 20% of the total AI GPU data center revenue for Nvidia. So if you have same kind of relationship for AMD, let's even go with the lower end of that target, 10 to 15%. I wouldn't be surprised if AMD takes in around 1 billion, in best case scenario 2.5 billion, just on the networking side next year. And next year you should also expect that AMD would have, at the bare minimum, every single quarter would be around 2 billion, most likely closer, the average would be 3 billion in AI GPU sales. And that's going to be hugely important for AMD, because remember I mentioned that if you look at here, like, they increased their net revenue on the data center by around 700 million. And then again, compared to the, let's say, same period last year, more than double it, but also the operating income tripled. And imagine what's going to happen next year, same kind of time. So if 1 year from now, I wouldn't be surprised if AMD is selling 6 billion or so in data center, and their operating income would be at the very least 2.5 billion. And actually, if we look closely on my own model, so let's go to what would that be, Q3 of 2025. According to my models, the total revenue would be 10 billion or so, data center 5.9, operating income 2.5 billion. And you can see that if you step it up every single quarter from Q3 of this year, we just got now, Remember these highlighted numbers, this column here, were my expectations, but again, the actual numbers are very, very similar to there. For example, the data center revenue 3460 here, and the actual number was 3549. So just around 100 million more than mine. But if you go around based on these numbers here, you can see that I think they can increase their AI GPU component here by around 600 million or so in Q4. And then I expect them to increase that from 600 to maybe another 800 million in Q1. And then again, another 600 in Q2 and another, let's say 500 in Q3. Some people actually argue that this is way too conservative point of view, but I just want to be, on the safe side. But that gets you, that gets you around 2.5 billion in operating income just on that one segment. And actually, I can see here immediately that if you look at the client segment, I was really surprised here. Maybe I was way too conservative, but at 1.8 billion or 1.9 billion, they had 276 million in operating income. And if you go to my numbers there, you can see that at 1.9 billion, I had 140. So essentially, they had a much higher margin on their client segment sales that I kind of expected, which means if I extrapolate these numbers as we go to next year, based on what I know now due to the Q3 numbers and the client segment being much, much stronger, I would say that we could have instead of 200 there, maybe we could have, let's go with, I don't know, 400. And that's gonna, together with the operating income from the data center, that's just 3 billion based on the two segments. And if the embedded segment recovers to some degree and as well the gaming, we could see close to 3.5 billion or so in operating income for AMD. And if you take that times, I don't know, let's say we take it times 4 times, that gives you around 14 billion or so in operating income. And I think that's great for a company like AMD. Like if they grow in at this kind of pace. Remember the market cap is at 270 billion or so, and if you take the 270 billion, so we have 270 divided by what did I say, 14 billion. So 270 divided by 14 gives you around less than 20 times PE ratio. So I think it's people are missing the big picture here in my opinion. Remember, we also had Rosenblatt mentioning that AMD's chiplet kind of strategy gains a little bit of, let's say, manufacturing prowess. So AMD is having, according to Rosenblatt, higher yield compared to Nvidia. And we can see that also OpenAI recently mentioned that they're going to diversify their AI GPU supply chain to include as well AMD as well as others, not only Nvidia. Remember, no one, as I mentioned time and time again, no one has in their own interest a future where Nvidia is the only supplier. We need, a bit of competition here, and that's why I think it's good to bet on AMD, despite maybe a bit of negative reaction today. I can see why people are a bit sad because the guidance as well for Q4 wasn't kind of blowing it out of the park. But I think people are kind of again missing the bigger picture here, because if you actually go back to my own numbers, so what did I expect? If you scroll here, if you go down all the way up there, so let's go to Q4 of 2024, 7.66, right? That was my own expectations. And what was the guidance? 7.5 plus minus 300 million. So essentially, I expected this kind of guidance. And why are people then so sad? I don't know, to be honest. I think they're way too over optimistic. Maybe people would think that AMD would have, I don't know, like a guidance of well above 8 or 9 billion and a data center guidance of, let's say, 5 billion or so already in Q4. But that's kind of unrealistic in my opinion. So you could have seen where this is going. You would have known if you followed what Lisa Su have said. You would have known that they had 600 million of AI GPU sales in Q1. You would have known that she mentioned time and time again that they just break over 1 billion in a single quarter, which was their fastest ramp in their entire history of AMD, which is great, in Q2. And then we also know that she increased the yearly guidance by 500 million in the previous quarter in Q2, right? For AI GPU sales from 4 billion to 4.5 billion. So what I did, I just said, let's say if they increase it by half a billion, and if he's saying that they would have expected 4.5 billion of AI GPU sales for entire of 2024, and if we already bagged 600 plus 1.1, that's 1.7, right? So that's around, let's say that's around 3 billion or so, 2.8 billion left. And I think she was a little bit sandbagging, and then we can see that that's actually true, because today she also mentioned that they increased their guidance again by another half a billion. So we are now at quite exactly 5 billion of AI GPU sales expected for AMD for 2024. And if we bagged it like 1.7 billion in Q1 and Q2, and in order to reach 5, you need obviously 3.3 billion or so between Q3 and Q4. Now, I was maybe a little bit above that guidance as well. I went with 5.4, but if we kind of draw it back a little bit by a couple of 100 million or 400 million, we get these numbers: 1.6 billion for Q3, which is now on 2.1 billion for Q4. And I genuinely believe that AMD will be on a much, much stronger position next year. Remember, they have another year of software catching up with Nvidia, not totally, but the difference between AMD's ROCm and Nvidia's CUDA will be less next year than it was this year. And we also know that AMD's MI350, not the 325 that they launched on the 10th of October, but the 350X will be, I would say that's the first time that Nvidia actually will have something really, really competitive with what they have at the same time. So as we go into the second half of next year, that's when I think AMD will get the big money. So if you look at these numbers, if my expectations for 2025 comes true, and remember this is only AI GPU sales, not data center, because AMD's data center again is what? It is the AI part of it, obviously the GPUs, which is called Instinct for AMD, and the EPIC part of it, the CPUs, which is called Zen, right? So EPIC. And in addition to that, remember I mentioned before in the video that Nvidia sales also include networking. And this networking AMD doesn't have right now, but they will have next year. So when you all add all of this together, when you see the comments from Rosenblatt, when you see the likes of OpenAI, when you see what Microsoft and Meta has said about diversifying and being really happy with AMD, and in terms of Microsoft, they also mentioned that AMD offers the best value per kind of installed GPU, so the cheapest AI output that they could get was from AMD. So if you consider all of these, if you consider that AMD will be another year, in terms of improving the software stack, which is ROCm compared to CUDA, and essentially Nvidia had, like, I don't know, a decade or so head start. And if you follow the market, you see that obviously Nvidia is still well ahead, but the distance between them is decreasing. So I genuinely don't understand why the stock is reacting this way. Again, if you also look at let's say some of the fundamentals, for example, a lot of people look at the earnings per share, and I always said that for AMD, you should have looked at the non-GAAP numbers, because previously until now, and I would say even until, let's say, late next year, the GAAP numbers are not showing the entire picture because they purchased Xilinx, and the amortization that they and the write-off cost of that purchase that they did in 2021 is anywhere between 6, 7, 800 million a quarter, and now decreasing to, let's say, closer to 590, 690 a quarter, and it kind of goes down to 20 or 40 million or so every single quarter. And as that kind of cost decreases and as the revenue increases at the same time, the difference between the GAAP earnings per share and the non-GAAP earnings per share kind of also decreases. And you can see here the basic so the GAAP earnings per share was 48 cents now in the latest Q3, which was 16 in the Q2. And then yeah, if you go to the non-GAAP numbers now, and I have them here, you can quickly see here for the difference there. You can see that the non-GAAP numbers for Q2 was 69, and the GAAP number was 16. So that's a 5x, 6x difference in GAAP to non-GAAP, right? Now that difference goes down a little bit because we now know that these are not updated numbers on this column here for Q3 because I just got the numbers. But we know that I was very close with my expectations. The actual numbers is 48 cents. So if you go with 48 cents that they just reported, and you know that the non-GAAP numbers, I think they reported them at around 92 cents. So now we are much more, less than 2x difference between them. And as time goes on, you can see here, according to my model, for Q4, we should be just below 70 cents in gap, and let's say, I don't know, 90 cents. But now I would say I would increase it to $1 or so based on what we just received. And yeah, as time goes on, the difference would be essentially minuscule. And you could see also maybe at one point where they would be at the same level by Q4 of next year. So when you consider all this, honestly, I don't understand why the stock is down. I would expect it, understand it if it was down a couple of percentages, but not this much because at 7.5 billion or so in Q4, that's another all-time high for AMD. And it's not like they're slowing down. And we know that the AI demand is huge, according to TSMC, according to Nvidia, according to Microsoft, and we know that. I mean, do you honestly think that the AI models that we do have now, like ChatGPT 4.5 or whatever it is, and Cloud and all the others, are the best variants that we're gonna have for next 10 years? Of course not. So they need to be another, iteration or two of the hardware and the software. And if the software needs to improve, you would need better hardware for it. And if the better hardware is needed, you don't only need Nvidia. Sure, Nvidia will do just fine, but you also need AMD. So I think if you never log into your stockbroker and come back next year, I think this stock price is relatively cheap right now. So yeah, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and please comment in the comment section and see what your thoughts are. Am I wrong? Am I too optimistic about AMD or not? And yeah, thank you for your time, and see you in the next one.